it happens at 3 p.m. too.
So this is the most climbing that we're going to do. I tried to keep our walk on a fairly level ground just because of the hazards within the cemetery. We have a nice little group here. So I would like to welcome you all to the community of Tremont, and in particular, I would like to welcome you to the old Tremont Cemetery. Within the gates of this cemetery lie the very people that founded this community. These were the people who established and built the businesses and the communities around us, and for many of us, they are in fact our direct ancestors. In this cemetery, we have teachers, miners, farmers, ministers, judges, businessmen, ordinary people.
Prime Minister.
Everybody that's buried here was somebody, and everybody has a story to tell. That's the purpose of a graveyard tour, is to tell the history of a community by the telling and the retelling of the story of people that are buried here. Now, I hope you all can hear me. Can you hear me okay? Okay. The church and the cemetery were established in 1851. 20 years later, the church building itself burnt down, and it was replaced 2 years after that. Now, obviously, any early paper records for this cemetery would have been lost when the church burnt down. Now, going forward from that time, I cannot tell you whether the Baptist Church maintained proper records for the cemetery or not, but what I can tell you is that in 2013, when the Tremont Community Cemetery Society obtained the assets of the two Tremont cemeteries, the records for the old cemetery was very lacking. In fact, we got no real paper records. The new cemetery, everything was intact. There was a burial book, there was index cards, maps, death certificates, it was all there. It's the active cemetery on the S-turn where we're still selling lots and burials are happening. This cemetery is considered a closed cemetery, but all we got for assets when we obtained this cemetery was a hand-drawn map that was drawn in 1980, a list of names that was taken from the headstones, and only a handful of death certificates, less than 30. And if you stop and think about it, there are over 500 people that we estimate are buried here. That's not a lot of paper records. So pretty much, unless a name was carved on a stone, we may not have those records. On the map, like I said, there was that lot for the poor and sick people, which was the purpose of our cemetery service here this evening. Now, when those people were buried, if there was any markers at all, most likely they would have had them wooden crosses or some other homemade marker, which would have deteriorated with time. And because they deteriorated, we don't really know exactly where they were buried or even who it was that was buried there, because we don't have the paper record to back it up. If they had a headstone that didn't withstand the test of time, there is one near the front gate there for McGill, where the stone itself has eroded. Again, we don't have the paper record for that burial to know who it is there. The only indication we have with the McGill stone is that there's a footstone that has initials on it. So, unless their name, like I say, is carved in stone, that's really all the records we got. But we're working to do what we can to correct that and to reclaim as much information about who is here as we can. There's certain individuals that have assisted us, and one of those in particular is Rick Noble from Torbrook. Now, Rick has a hobby where he likes to match obituaries to headstones, and there's a website called findagrave.com, and he has the Tremont cemeteries on there. And he has done a lot to assist us by obtaining the obituaries and putting them on this website. We've actually found some people that don't have a headstone, but he found an obituary that stated that they were buried in Tremont. But from those obituaries, we have actually learned a lot about those that we know are buried here, and a lot of their stories, and that's where we've gotten a lot of the information that we are going to share with you tonight about the stories of people who were buried here. So I'm going to start the tour at what I refer to as the executive lot, which is that lot up there. Now, you can tell by the placement of that lot and the size of the monuments that are on it that those were the elect of our community. the leaders of the community. Now this lot is predominantly the Baker lot. In particular, there is a stone right there. I don't know if you can see it, but that is the stone for Deacon Calvin Baker.
Which stone? Where is it?
It's in the front row, and it's 1, 2, 3, and
Excuse me. So that's where
that.
the Ray ladies married?
I'll get to that. Just be
Oh,
patient, Molly.
Okay.
Okay, Deacon Calvin Baker. His family was said to have donated the land for the cemetery and the church, and he is reported to have been the first to lay out the lot, lay out the tier, as you can see it, for his family to be buried. So he is actually regarded as the founder of the cemetery. The obituary for Deacon Baker notes that he was an extremely remarkably hospitable man. Anyone who needed a place to stay overnight, weary travelers going through the community, they could always stay at Deacon Baker's house. So the next stone I'm going to point out is one at the end, and that is the stone for Thomas Tupper Esquire. Thomas Tupper Esquire was a magistrate, which is a judge. What's interesting about his obituary is it tells the tale of his somewhat rebellious youth, but perhaps that's what made him a better judge in time. So the next stone I wanted to point out is in the second row, and it's the tallest stone in the back there. That is the headstone for Reverend Charles Tupper, our famous resident. We cited him as our famous person when we made our heritage application, and I actually kind of owe Reverend Tupper an apology. My assumption that other than being a well-known Baptist minister, I assumed that his claim to fame had more to do with who he sired than anything that he himself had done. We know his son from his first marriage as Sir Charles Tupper, who was one of our fathers of Confederation, and he actually served as a Prime Minister of Canada.
In 1896.
Exactly. But Reverend Tupper himself was actually more than just a regular pastor. In fact, he may well have been one of the most important Baptist figures in 19th century Maritimes. And we are actually very fortunate tonight because I do believe Reverend Tupper is going to come and speak with us. Good evening, Reverend Tupper.
There is no need to apologize, Mrs. Reeves, as I'd far rather the focus of your tour be on my parishioners than myself. My son Charles did indeed do well for himself and our great country. However, it was those less fortunate that I spent most of my life focused on. My life was a long labor for the cause of Christ. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you all for taking the time out of your busy lives to come and visit the wonderful people of my congregation here and listen to their stories. I am a man of humble beginnings. My parents immigrated to Nova Scotia from Connecticut in the early 1760s and farmed for a living. I was born in 1794 in Cornwallis Township on the family farm. There was little time or money for schooling. However, I had a keen mind, and I had a teaching position at the age of 19. I continued to seek out for knowledge, and had a love of learning languages. In fact, by the age of 65, I had a reading knowledge of 10 languages. My parents were Presbyterian. However, I was becoming increasingly influenced by the Baptist minister at Cornwallis, Reverend Edward Manning. I went through a period of great doubt and uncertainty. But in February of 1815, I had a very deep and very personal life experience. I finally knew who God was and what He wanted me to do. I was then baptized by immersion on May 14th, 1815 by Reverend Edward Manning and Reverend Theodore Seth Harding. I lived in the Amherst area with my first wife, Miriam Lowe, and our 5 children. I was teaching at the time, although I had a meager salary, but I had to take care of my family. Early on, I realized the dangers of alcohol, and so I advocated total abstinence from it. I even established some of the first temperance societies in 1829 and 1830. As the first vice president of the Baptist Education Society, I helped establish Horton Academy in Wolfville for my fellow Baptists who were excluded from Anglican King's College in Windsor. Horton Academy then expanded to become Queen's College 10 years after, and where I received my honorary degree as Doctor of Divinity. When the Baptist Church was established in Tremont in 1851, I was assigned in Lower Aylesford. My first wife Miriam had passed, and so I moved here just down the road in what is now known as the Tupper House. I then met and married Mary Miller in 1852. Our marriage lasted 15 years, although we went through many great trials. And then she died, after which I had a third wife, Betsy Knowles. I then died in 1881 and laid to rest beside my beloved Mary. I was honored when the Christian Messenger published my obituary, stating, "A great man and the standard bearer in Israel has fallen." But enough about me. Go and learn about my great congregation.
Thank you, Reverend Tupper.
Thank you.
Reverend Tupper is very humble. He neglected to mention that he himself actually wrote most of the obituaries for the parishioners in the cemetery. So just before we leave the executive tier, there was one other headstone I wanted to point out to you. You see that tall one up there, the very elaborate one?
Yeah.
That is the monument for Nathan Baker. It's the most elaborate that we have in the cemetery. It's made from white bronze or zinc, which is actually a metal, not a stone.
Wow.
And as beautiful and elaborate as his stone is, ironically, the stone that's next to it is his wife Sarah. And Sarah in the modern day is more well known or famous than her husband, who has the elaborate stone. The reason being, if anyone has ever played the online game of Pokemon Go, Sarah's headstone is a Pokestop. But unfortunately, whoever deciphered her headstone got her name incorrectly. They have it as being Sarah E. Reach, R-E-A-C-H. In fact, her name is Sarah E. Baker, with Ray, R-E-A-G-H, being her maiden name. Okay, we're going